where we have the keynote speaker. Unfortunately, Judith Plasko couldn't be here tonight, but we have a recording of her together with Rabbi Rebecca Burke. This will also be that will be streamed to Facebook and YouTube. Then we have another session which starts at midnight, rabbis at midnight. And there people, again, will break into breakout rooms and have a study session together. Then from 1:15 to 5 o'clock, you're welcome to join 3 sessions run by our rabbis, and everybody's welcome to join. At 5 o'clock, Rabbi Igor Zinkov will be running an early Shacharit. The idea is for it to be short. And at 11 o'clock, there will be a full Shabbat morning service at the LJS. And this service will be also streamed into YouTube. Just about session slot 1, which starts at 8:30. And this is an overview of what we're going to do. Rabbi Zinkov is going to have a quiz in room 1. Rabbi Margaret Jacoby will be in room 2. Rabbi Richard Jacoby with a session for conversion students in room 3. Judaism and Freemasonry by Rabbi Rene Fretzel at session room 4. And the clay tablets of the British Museum by Dr. Irvin Finkel at session 5. Note that the session 5 is the default session. That means that if you do not select a session, that will be the session you will end up enjoying the tablets of the British Museum. The next session, again, we have 5 concurrent sessions. That is at 10:30 with talking about the Ark Synagogue, Rabbi Aaron Goldstein in room 1. He has married a Cushite woman by Rabbi Alex Wright. Room 3 will be I Was There, You Were There by Professor Aidan Coyle. Note that this is going to be the default. And room 4, Rift in the Space-Time Continuum by Rabbi Neil James. Room 5, Back to the Future, and that is about Ruth the Convert, Now and There and Today, and that is by me. Just a few things to remember during the session, during the service and the study sessions. And that is, if you need to know the full program and details of all the sessions that I've just described, they are all in the following link. You can go to liberaljudaism.org/Shavuot, and all the program is there with the details. Then one request, during the service, you will be muted, but keep yourself muted during study sessions. You can unmute yourselves, but only do so if you have something to contribute. Otherwise, and of course, if you walk away from your computer, then again, put it on mute so there are no sound disturbances. Now, before the session slots where we break into breakout rooms, I'm asking you to add a number to your name according to the session that you wish to join. So as you can see at the bottom corner, I added number 3, Rabbi Yuval Keren, to my name, so that the person who will send me to that breakout room knows that I want to join session 3. And don't forget to change it by the time you get to the second session, if you stay for that session. That's session 3 later. If you can't rename yourself, just raise your hand, and basically, I'm hoping you can see, especially with the if you have a background screen, it might not work. You might have to put it in front of your shirt or something for people to see what it is. And as I indicated, there are default sessions, so make sure you indicate which sessions you want to go to so that we know where to send you. We're now going to continue with the Shavuot evening service.
Thank you, It's a real pleasure to be part of this event with all of you across the country in liberal Judaism. It's also such a pleasure that it feels as if Shavuot is finding its place again as a festival now that we can all join together online, and that feels joyful too. There are definitely, as we know, some good things that have come out of the current crisis. It's also traditional to wish one another Chag Sameach on this festival. It doesn't feel very joyful. We're all too conscious of what's going on in Israel and Palestine. But nevertheless, we hope that the joy of Torah, which we find over Shavuot, will inspire us on this festival and give us hope and perhaps some wisdom with which we might go forward. You can follow in your Siddur, and the page numbers are on the screen as well, and I'll announce them just in case you can't see the screen very clearly. So we're going to start on page 416. In the spirit of our ancient tradition, which unites and sanctifies the house of Israel in all lands and ages, we welcome the festival of Shavuot by kindling these lights. And do join with me in your homes as we say the bracha. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav, v'tzivanu lahadlik ner shel Yom Tov. And we give thanks on reaching this day. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, shehechiyanu v'kiyamanu v'higiyanu lazman hazeh. Tonight, as summer approaches, we celebrate the ripening beauty of the world, and tonight on the Festival of Revelation, we celebrate the moral and spiritual beauty that we can experience in our lives. At this season in ages past, our ancestors stood at Mount Sinai and felt themselves in the presence of the eternal God, and they pledged themselves to the service of God. For humanity's developing awareness of moral and spiritual truth since that time, we give thanks. May our remembrance of the day of revelation and of all that grew from it inspire in us renewed loyalty to our heritage and give us strength to continue to labour for a better world. On the third new moon after the people of Israel had gone out of Egypt, on that very day they came to the wilderness of Sinai. From Rephidim they had marched straight to the wilderness of Sinai and made camp there, facing the mountain. Then Moses went up to God. The Eternal One called to him from the mountain, saying, "Say this to the house of Jacob, tell this to the people of Israel.
You have seen what I did to the Egyptians, how I carried you on eagle's wings and brought you here to me.
Now, if you will listen to me and keep my covenant, then you shall be my own treasured people, though all the world is mine.
You shall be to me a community of priests, a holy nation."
So Moses went down and called the elders of the people together and told them all that God had commanded him.
Then all the people answered as one, saying, "All that God has spoken, we will do."
On page 425, 425. Elohim Yechonenenu Vivarachenu, Ya'er Panav Itanu, Selah. Lada'at ba'aretz darkecha, V'chol goyim Yeshuatecha. Yoducho ha'amim Elohim, Yoducha amim kulam. Yismachu v'ranenu le'umim. Ki tishpot amim mishor, Ule'umim ba'aretz Tanchem Selah. Yoducha Amim Elohim, Yoducha Amim Kulam. Eretz Natal Yivula, Yivarachenu Elohim, Eloheinu. Yivarachenu Elohim. V'yiru Oto, Kol Afsei Aretz.
And we turn now to page 427. 427. Baruchu et Adonai HaMevorach. Baruch Adonai HaMevorach Leolam Vaed. We praise you, eternal one, our God, sovereign of the universe, whose word brings on the evening, whose wisdom opens heaven's gates, whose understanding changes stars and seasons, and whose will set the stars in their courses in the sky. You make day and night, rolling light away from darkness and darkness from light. You make day pass and bring on the night, and separate day from night. You rule the host of heaven. We praise you, O God. Your word makes evening fall.
Ahavat olam, ahavat olam, et Yisrael ameha ahavta, Torah u'mitzvot, ukim u'mishpatim, otanu limadeta, Aken Adonai Eloheinu B'shak benu uvekumenu naziach behukeha v'nismak b'difet olateha ובמצוותיה לעולם ועד, כי הם היינו באורך ימינו, ובהם נהגה יומם ולילה, יומם ולילה. אל תסיר ממנו, אל תסיר ממנו לעולמים.
ברוך אתה אדוני אוהב עמו ישראל. Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad. Baruch Shem Kevod Malchuto Leolam Vaed. ואהבת את אדוני אלוהיך בכל לבבך ובכל נפשך ובכל מאודיך. והיו הדברים האלה אשר אנוכי מצווך היום על לבביך, ושיננתם לבניך ודיברת בם, בשבתך בביתך, ובלכתך בדרך, ובשורבך ובקומך, וקשרתם לאות על ידיך, והיו לטוטפות בין עיניך, וכתבתם על מזוזות ביתך ובשעריך.
למען תזכרו ועשיתם את כל מצוותיי, הייתם קדושים לאלוהיהם. אני אדוני אלוהיהם, אשר הוצאתי Baruch lachem leElohim. Ani Adonai, Adonai Elohechem.
On page 429, and this blessing is the blessing of Hakarat Hatov, or gratitude. And on every evening service, we remember the reasons why we're grateful for. All this we hold to be true and sure. You alone, Eternal One, are our God, and we are Israeli people. You have freed us from oppressors and delivered us from tyrants. You led us out of Egypt forever to serve you in freedom. When we witness your power, we praise your name and gave thanks. Willingly, we accepted your rule. Then, full of joy, we sang together.
Mi hamo ha'balim Adonai, mi hamo ha'nedar b'kodesh, noda tehilot Yosef ele, ora tehilot Yosef ele. Adonai imloch le'olam va'et, Adonai imloch le'olam va'et.
ונאמר, כי פדה אדוני את יעקב, וגאלו מיד חזק ממנו. ברוך אתה אדוני, גאל ישראל. On page 431. Adonai sefatai tiftach, ufi yagid tehilatecha. Eternal God, open my lips, that my mouth may declare your praise. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu ve'Elohei avoteinu ve'emoteinu, Elohei Avraham, Elohei Yitzchak ve'Elohei Yaakov, Elohei Sarah, Elohei Rivka, Elohei Rachel ve'Elohei Leah, האל הגדול, הגיבור והנורא, אל עליון, גומל חסדים טובים וקונה הכל, וזוכה חסדי אבות ואימהות, ומביא גאולה לבני בניהן, למען שמו באהבה. מלך עוזר ומושיע ומגן, ברוך אתה אדוני, מגן אברהם ועזרת שרה. אתה גיבור לעולם אדוני, מחיה מתים אתה רב להושיע, משיב הרוח ומוריד הגשם, מזריע השמש ומוריד הטל.
מהקל חיים בחסד, מחיה מתים ברחמים, רחמים רבים. סומך נופלים ורופא הלים, ומתיר אסורים, ומקיים אמונתו לשני עפר. מלחמה בגבולות, ומי דומה לך? מלך ממיט ומאיה, ומצמיח ישועה.
ונאמן אתה להחיות מתים, ברוך אתה אדוני מחיה המתים. קדוש אתר ונורא שמך, ואין לנו אלוה מבלעדיך, ברוך אתה אדוני האל הקדוש. You have given us a special task among the peoples. In your love and favor, you have sanctified us by your commandments, drawn us near to your service, and charged us to make known your great and holy name. In your love, eternal one, our God, you have given us feasts of joy and seasons of gladness, among them this festival of Shavuot, season of revelation, to unite us in worship and in remembrance. אלוהינו ואלוהי אבותינו ואמותינו, יעלה ויבוא ויזרח זכרנו וזיכרון כל עמך בית ישראל לפניך, לטובה ולברכה, לחיים ולשלום, ביום חג השבועות הזה. Our God and God of ancestors, be mindful of us and all your people of the house of Israel. Grant us well-being and blessing, life and peace on this festival of Shavuot. This day, remember us for well-being. Amen. Bless us with your presence. Amen. Grant us continued life. Amen. Grant, eternal God, that our observance of the festivals may bring us blessing, happiness, and joy. Sanctify us in your commandments, and make us loyal to your teaching. Satisfy us with your goodness, gladden us with your salvation, and purify our hearts to serve you in truth. And grant, eternal God, that the happiness of the festivals may be with us always. We praise you, O God, you hallow Israel and the festivals. ירצה אדוני אלוהינו בעמך ישראל, ותפילתם באהבה תקבל, ותהי לרצון תמיד עבודת ישראל עמך. ברוך אתה אדוני, שאותך לבדך בעירך נעבוד. We praise you, O God, whom alone we worship in reverence. מודים אנחנו לך. We give thanks that you, Eternal One, are our God as you were the God of ancestors. You are the rock of our life, the power that shields us in every age. We thank and praise you for our lives which are in your hand, for our souls which are in your keeping, for the signs of your presence we encounter every day, and for your wondrous gifts at all times, morning, noon, and night. We praise you, O God, source of goodness, to whom our thanks are due. On page 436. Simon, I think you're doing Shalom Rav, yeah?
Shalom Rav al Yisrael ha'atasim le'olam. Shalom Rav al Yisrael ha'atasim le'olam. Ki ata hu melech adon l'adon ha'shalom. Ki ata hu melech adon l'chol ha'shalom. Shalom Rav al Yisrael ha'atasim le'olam. Shalom Rav al Yisrael ha'atasim le'olam. V'tov b'necha levarech et am ha'Yisrael b'chol et ub'chol sha'ah b'shlomecha. Shalom Rav al Yisrael ha'atasim le'olam. Baruch atah Adonai oseh hashalom, oseh hashalom, oseh hashalom.
We praise you, O God, the source of peace. And with God's peace in our hearts, we take a few moments of prayer and meditation. עושה שלום במרומיו, הוא יעשה שלום עלינו ועל כל ישראל ועל כל בני אדם, ואמרו אמן.
עושה שלום במרומיו, הוא יעשה שלום עלינו ועל כל ישראל ועל כל בני אדם.
We're now going to move to the reciting of the Hallel, the Psalms of Praise, as it is a major festival. We're going to begin with the blessing, which you can find on page 468. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kedeshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu likro et ha'Hallel. And we're going to continue with Psalm 117 on page 474.
Hallelu et Adonai Elohim, shabehu kol ha'umim, ki gaba alenu hasto ve'amet Adonai le'olam. Alleluia. Hodu l'Adonai ki tov, ki
page 476. And I'm hoping that Rabbi Charlie Baginski is with us, as I'm going to invite her to give us the address for the festival evening.
I want to acknowledge how difficult it is for anyone to give a sermon at the moment. We're often taught as rabbis that you need to rewrite your sermon at the last minute, depending on what is happening. And I have to admit to having rewritten this sermon several times based on events of the last few days. But there comes a point where you have to give the sermon that you've written. But I do want to acknowledge that there is a lot of fear around from people that today has been, particularly in the UK, a very difficult day, and that many of our hearts and minds and heads are in a multiple of different places tonight as we spend this Shavuot together. I often wish that I were dead, instead of lying here in bed and torturing my silly head with everything from A to Z, with germs and poisons being spread and all that blood so freely shed. And why we're all so badly led, and who should do the job instead? And what was it my wife once said about what's in the garden shed, and what became of poor old Ted? And while I think about it, Fred, and why I am not better read, and should I move to Leatherhead? I often wish that I were dead and free from mortal fear and dread. But here I am tucked up in bed, hanging by a tiny thread. One High Holy Days, when I was the rabbi of Kingston Liberal Synagogue, I began each of my sermons with a poem from A.A. Milne, ending on Yom Kippur with this one. I probably do not need to tell you, but this poem is not from When We Are Six, or indeed from any of the poetry of A.A. Milne, but it's rather a parody by the more modern poet Christopher Matthew on If I Were King. He has several volumes of poetry, all based around the poems from When We Were Very Young and Now We Are Six, and now entitled Now We Are 60 and When We Were 50. They are very clever and they embody the difficult to replicate rhythm and feel of the A.A. Milne genre. But their content is updated for the now older audience, who he feels are thinking more about Alka-Seltzer than rice pudding, and more about the Queen's purse than the King's breakfast. That last sermon on Yom Kippur was about Israel. I said at the time it was the sermon I'd been avoiding, but that at that season of confronting ourselves truthfully, then that had to be the moment to give that sermon. When Rabbi Karen asked me to give this sermon tonight, none of us had any idea that the news from Israel would be dominating tonight and all the nights that have been leading up to it in the way that it has been. But at this season of Shavuot, in this moment of revelation and tikkun, repair, there is no way for me to talk about anything else. I came back to this poem on Friday morning as I tried to find some space to write this sermon. I just got off the phone to a friend who also leads a Jewish organisation, and their words were echoing around my head, for they had voiced out loud the words that I know so many of us have felt in the last week. They spoke of the deep fear and pain they felt at saying anything on the situation in Israel and Palestine. They are really an exceptional leader, brave and articulate, and yet they felt paralysed. Not because they did not have something really important to offer, but because something is happening within our community and outside it, which is silencing leadership. I've heard the same thing from our rabbis and other lay leaders this week within liberal Judaism and other denominations. The level of abuse that is levelled at anyone who says something that is considered to be the wrong thing by the other side is nothing short of frightening. While I understand that many feel they own the moral high ground, the deliberate attempts to shame, humiliate, and intimidate others is not acceptable. As we enter into this period of Shavuot, Jews around the world gather together in any way that is possible this year to study through the night. This practice of all-night Torah study is known as Tikkun Leil Shavuot, and the tradition dates back to the 16th century Sfat. It's said that the famous Kabbalist Rabbi Isaac Luria, often known as the Ari, instituted the practice as a tikkun, a correction or repair for an ancient error. We know this word well, the first half of the phrase tikkun olam, repairing or healing the world through acts of social justice. So what is the breach that we are repairing tonight? As we know, Shavuot commemorates the giving of the Torah to the Israelites. One midrash tells us that the Israelites prepared for the giving of the Torah by getting a good night's sleep. But the next day they slept in, and the base of Mount Sinai was left empty. The midrash says that Moses ended up having to wake them up with a shofar blast, leading God to say, "Why have I come and no one is here to receive me?" In order to rectify this mistake, the Ari instituted an all-night learning to show that we are indeed ready to receive both the Torah and God. Many of us do not like the idea of inheriting our ancestors' errors, but it's more than that. On Shavuot, it's customary to turn not to Torah, but to the oral Torah, to Mishnah and Talmud, to focus instead on the additional voices and to add our own to the mix, reminding ourselves that we must value this multi-vocal tradition that values new pathways to wisdom. And this is the reparation I want us to commit to this Shavuot. 3 things have brought me hope this week. Firstly, the 200 progressive Jews who came together to share their feelings and emotions last night, who were able to listen and talk to each other with all their pain and frustration and fear. Secondly, the fact that so many people, both in Israel and here, have been sharing their coexistent pictures, their demonstrations and actions that show people still believe. And lastly, the number of people from other faiths and none who have reached out to me and wanted to talk, who have not shot to post their opinions, but have wanted to listen and think what we can do together. But before we move to action, we need to deal with our own conflicted selves. I, personally, am a religious, progressive Zionist who supports a 2-state solution with a free and prosperous Palestine, one which could be a good neighbour to Israel. I want to say no to rockets and no to airstrikes, no to occupation and racism, no to settlements and no to hatred. But I also know that there is no easy solution. And I also know that we do not know exactly the pathway to peace. And I know as someone who has lost people to terror, that it does not make you want to react with a rational and cool head. I can admit to all of you today that just as I find it difficult to be objective about my family due to my weighty emotional connection to them, so do I find the same regarding Israel. While I'm perfectly willing to criticise my family, as no doubt they will concur to their faces, were someone outside our small family grouping to do so, I would find this immensely difficult to hear or to be party to. Once again, the same is true of Israel. In Israel, I'm happy to critique her policies, berate her politicians, join demonstrations, object to her plans and actions. But I find this much harder to do in the UK because it feels so very personal. But here we are in 2021, years after the declaration of the State of Israel, and Israel finds herself continually berated and often friendless. She is the subject of constant discussion, UN resolutions and media speculation. While many seem to ignore the tragic plight of other people across the globe, they find time to focus on Israel. While ignorance prevents many from commenting on the political situation in other countries, they seem happy to act as experts on Israel, and any defense we offer seems to fall on deaf ears. It's frustrating, upsetting, demoralizing, and ultimately exhausting. I'm regularly tempted to just avoid discussions about Israel as it's just too hard work. If you've ever wondered to yourself as you get pulled into a debate about Israel, why bother? They're never going to listen to me anyway. You're not alone. I've been there too many times. It is for all these reasons and more that I understand why there are some people who argue that Israel has enough to distract us and that we as Jews must instead give Israel our unequivocal support. I get it. I really do. And yet this move to try and prevent those Jews who want to criticise Israel from feeling comfortable in doing so, who try to silence even those who speak from a position of love and support but feel unable to say I agree with everything Israel does, is not the way either. I am saddened that too often I have heard genuine, thoughtful Jewish critiques of Israel being labelled as self-hating Jews and Israel bashers. There is a new label of choice which is perpetuating our horizon, and that's the idea that criticism of Israel is in and of itself an act of delegitimization of the state and must therefore be silenced. And it happens the other way as well, with the shaming and name-calling and accusations of racism and lack of morality when other views are shared. I cannot believe that threats and shaming do anything to change another's mind. Rather entrenches some and buries others in fear and silence. Any discussion of Israel is for many of us like a raw critique of our own selves. Whatever we or others say about Israel, it is as though we are talking about our own very deep personal hopes and fears, values and sense of self. The writer J. Michelson wrote an article over a decade ago now called How I Am Losing My Love for Israel. There is one part of the article which stays with me. He says, "My love of Israel has turned into a series of equivocations. I do not support the expansion of settlements, but the Palestinians bear primary responsibility for the collapse of the peace process in 1909. The Israelis acted overzealously in Gaza, but they must be entitled to defend themselves against rocket attacks. Yes, the separation wall is odious, but it is also effective and necessary. Yes, but no, but defend, but. At some point, the complexity and ambiguity wears one out." Of course, we know that the fairy tale Israel of the Yishuv postcards does not exist. People are not dancing the horror in the streets while eating Jaffa oranges. And we do need a new picture, a real picture, no more slogans. But we also need a little more honesty with ourselves and with others. Let us not be afraid to tell people we love Israel, but equally let us not be afraid to say that sometimes that love is very hard to give. I know that those of you with kids love them unconditionally, but that love does not stop you from telling them when they go wrong. We would shift heaven and earth to help them get back on track. And the same must be true for Israel. I am begging all of you here tonight to lead that reparation from this moment. It's not about right or left or who is right and who is wrong. It's about talking, acting, and letting others have their say too, learning from each other. We must share our conflicted selves. This is not the time to be silenced by those who say, "Who are you to have an opinion about Israel? You do not live there." Or by those who say that unless we unequivocally support one way or another, we are in the moral swamp and should be shut down. We do not live there, but our lives are forever bound up in its future. In a response to the Michelson piece, the director of the Shalom Institute, Daniel Gordis, wrote, "The real question, I think, is not whether we're exhausted, but rather what do we do with our exhaustion? Like you, Jay, I know that I was raised on an image of Israel that does not really exist. Maybe it never did. Like you, there were open fields in Jerusalem that I used to love that are now filled by large apartment buildings. But when we lived in the San Fernando Valley in Los Angeles, our older neighbors used to reminisce about the days when our neighborhood had all been orange groves. Did they stop loving America because fields got built on? I didn't sense that. When we live in America and watch fields get built up, we sense progress. But when it's a field in the Israel of our youth that's now gone, we feel betrayed. What's that about? Maybe it's time we all moved beyond puppy love and ventured into something more mature, a sort of love that knows that the object of our love cannot and should not remain unchanged year after year, decade after decade." I agree with Gordis. His response reminds me that of Soloveitchik's theology. It's all about how we respond to our conflicted selves. I believe we must be the Jacobs who wrestle with themselves and the Abrahams who continue even in the hardest of times to answer Hineni, here I am, and do our utmost not to allow ourselves and others to become Isaac, traumatized into silence. Arundhati Roy, the author of The God of Small Things, writes, "The trouble is that once you see it, you can't unsee it. And once you've seen it, keeping quiet, saying nothing, becomes as political an act as speaking out. There is no innocence. Either way, you are accountable." We have all seen and heard so much from all sides and perspectives. We must try and keep telling the whole story for the sake of justice and for the sake of peace, for the sake of Israel, for the sake of Palestine, and for the sake of ourselves. And we must, for the sake of our relationships with each other, and thus for the sake of Israel and Klal Yisrael, find a way to model dialogue for the sake of heaven, and believe that someone else's voice has a space. We cannot talk the words of peace and expect it of others, while we cannot ourselves show that we really believe it. Ken Yehi Ratzon, may that be God's will.
Amen. I wanted to thank Rabbi Charlie for agreeing to deliver today's address, not knowing actually that this is what's going to happen, and judging by the comments that I can see just running on Zoom, you really are a force for uniting for a subject that I know can be very divisive. And has been divisive. So thank you very much, and Yishar Koach. Now we need to follow this, but we're going to carry on with the service, and we are going to carry on with the Aleinu. Let me just find it.
לתת גדולה לעצר ברשת, אשר שמחנו לאחד את שמו, וגורלנו להמליך מלכותו. ואנחנו קוראים ומשתחווים ומודים לפני מלך וידעת היום, וידעת היום, והשיבות אל לבביך. כי אדוני הוא האלוהים, בשמיים ממעון, ועל הארץ, ועל הארץ, מתחת אין עוד.
והיה אדוני למלך על כל הארץ, ביום ההוא יהיה אדוני אחד, יהיה אדוני אחד, ושמו
Our thoughts now turn to our friends, family members, and community members who celebrated this festival of Shavuot with us in years past and who are no longer in our midst. Though vanished from our sight, they live on in our hearts. For goodness is indestructible, and what was good in their lives endures forever. God unfolds them in the mystery of eternity as we embrace them in undying memory. And today I would also like to add victims of violence in Israel, whether Jewish, Arabs, who passed away this week, and may God bring peace to all. Zichronam livracha, may the memory be for a blessing. We honor their memory with the praise of God's name, with the words of the Mourner's Kaddish. יתגדל ויתקדש שמי רבה, בעלמא דברך חירותי וימליך מלכותי, בחייכון וביומכון ובחיי דכל בית ישראל, בעגלה ובזמן קריב ואמרו אמן. יהי שמי רבה מברך לעלם ולעולמי עולמיה. יתברך וישתבח ויתפאר ויתרומם ויתנשא, ויתהדר ויתעלה ויתהלל, שמי דקודשה בריחו. לאלה מן כל ברכתה ושירתה, תושבחתה ונחמתה, ואמירן בעלמא ואמרו אמן. יהי שלמה רבה מן שמיה, וחיים עלינו ועל כל ישראל ואמרו אמן. עושה שלום ממרומיו, הוא יעשה שלום, עלינו ועל כל ישראל, ועל כל בני אדם, ואמרו אמן. And we are going to go straight into the final song, this song which is talking about God, Moses, Torah, and Israel, very much relevant to Shavuot. If you have the prayer book, you can find it on page 649. And I'm going to sing it a cappella. En adir k'Adonai ve'en baruch keven ameram, en gedola k'Torah ve'en darshaneh k'Yisrael, mipi el umipi el, yevorach kol Yisrael. En hadur k'Adonai ve'en vatik keven ameram, en zahaka k'Torah ve'en hachameh k'Yisrael, mipi el umipi el, yevorach kol Yisrael. En tahor k'Adonai ve'en yachid keven ameram, en kabira k'Torah ve'en lamdaneh k'Yisrael, mipi el umipi el, yevorach kol Yisrael. En melech k'Adonai ve'en navi keven ameram, אין סגולה כתורה, ואין עוסקיה כישראל, מפי אל ומפי אל, יבורך כל ישראל. אין פודק אדוני, ואין צדיק כבן עמרם, אין קדושה כתורה, ואין רוממיה כישראל, מפי אל ומפי אל, יבורך כל ישראל. אין קדוש כאדוני, ואין רבי כבן עמרם, אין שמירה כתורה, ואין תומכיה כישראל, מפי אל ומפי אל, יבורך כל ישראל, מפי אל ומפי אל, יבורך כל ישראל. We're going to move to the final blessing, which concludes our service. Page 529. מי ששכן את שמו בבית הזה, הוא ישכין ביניכם אהבה ואחווה ושלום ורעות. Where the one whose presence dwells in this Zoom cause love and harmony, peace and friendship to dwell among you. I wish you all Chag Shavuot Sameach.